Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. This is Dave Nagel, and I'm very excited to share some information with my friends and colleagues at David Reece Elementary. My colleague Karen Flores will be doing the same thing with several webinars coming up, and we might even do a couple of them together collaboratively. We wanted to follow up, as we had mentioned when we were visiting approximately about a month ago, back in December, on some of the pieces that we talked about and preparing for some more of our opportunities to come together this spring, but most importantly, to give you the support and follow up that we had talked about that's so important in any learning, but certainly with professional development when we can't always come together for long periods of time, that we need that ability to learn and go deeper. So we're going to go ahead and get started right now. Obviously, this is not a live webinar, so the interactivity is a little bit different, but we wanted to just be real clear that we want to have as much back and forth dialogue as possible. So you see our cell phones there. Mine's the first one, the 317 number. You see our emails and then the Twitter handle. Please do not hesitate to reach out to either one of us anytime during this spring or beyond with questions or thoughts or ideas as well. So really looking forward to having any of those come in at any time throughout the process. Hopefully you have your working handout in front of you. And for each of the webinars, we will put together a handout that will allow for some reflection, even some activity. We're going to assume that you're watching these in collaborative settings, maybe as a PLC or whole staff. Certainly some folks might be viewing them individually, but we're going to assume that it's happening in a collaborative group. So we'll always have a handout that will allow for activities and reflection. And what we will do is we will pause momentarily on the recording, where you will need to probably hit pause on the computer screen and take as much time as you need to complete any of the reflections or activities. Whenever you see this slide, that's code for it's a reflection, time to pause and get some ideas down and take as much time to dialogue with your peers. And this would be code for there's an activity where you'll need some more time to reflect and complete whatever task we've encouraged you to complete. And then sometimes might even need to come back the next day or your next PLC setting to complete the rest of the webinar. That's why we set these up this way, so that it could be a learning experience, not just a sit and retrieve information. You see here the 3 learning intentions. We want to start with teacher clarity. You always see these in the handouts as well. But we're going to focus back on those 3 core elements of developing collective teacher efficacy and dig into a little bit how we develop the first 2 around mastery of skills and positive interdependence. And we're going to look a little bit how we develop deeper levels of relational trust, and again, specifically in our collaborative settings. And you will know when you've met the success or learning intentions, when you can complete these 2 success criteria. What actions can help better develop the first 2 elements of collective teacher efficacy? And then specifically, how can you increase the level of relational trust across the board, but specifically on the team or teams that you work with in those collaborative settings? How can we build that in? And we're going to talk a little bit in detail about what we mean by relational trust in 4 core elements. Coming back to our core that John Hattie challenges us on is that everything we do in our schools has to be focused around student learning and how we increase student learning to the highest levels. And we do so by increasing the learning of our adults. And so, as we talked about at the beginning of the day back on the 16th, collective teacher efficacy, which comes in at 1.57 in terms of its effect size, is when the collective group of teachers has the beliefs that collectively our actions can promote the most successful outcomes of the students within our school. But we can't just buy collective teacher efficacy. It's not going to come by and then we just channel it and funnel it and share it out with everybody. It really gets developed. And these are the 3 elements that really drive it. We're going to focus today on the first 2 and applying new knowledge and developing mastery, what it means to dig into positive interdependence. Now, in terms of the concrete and specifics around the mastery learning experiences, Karen's going to follow up shortly with several webinars you'll see here next in the series on digging into deeper levels of text complexity and how we develop quality text complexive questions. But then it also could be anything that we're working on in our schools, anything that we're helping us develop and get better at, because as teachers, we're not going to put things in place if we're not comfortable with them. We're very busy, and the more we feel uncomfortable about a strategy, we might not be willing to put it in place. But that's why we're going to talk today about positive interdependence, that we have the ability to trust each other and to make mistakes and to fall down and to learn and have our colleagues and peers support us in that process. We're going to come back in webinar 2 and dig in a little bit more around fine-grained discourse around student learning. Some of these slides might be a little bit of a review, but pretty pretty honest, I think, if we think about it as teachers. If we only acquire new knowledge, then it's likely anything that's going to change. So if we just read it or we watch it on the slides, we don't apply it and go deeper, it's really not going to change our practice on a day-to-day basis. And that our strengths and our weaknesses, what we're good at, what we struggle with, are weighed during practice. So when we're developing text-dependent questions as a PLC and we're putting them up on the screen and getting some feedback back and forth, we'll probably determine where our strengths and where the places we need to grow are. And that mastery experience where we get better is such a powerful source of us developing that collective efficacy, because we can learn from each other and we can begin to be honest about where our strengths are and maybe some of our shortcomings are. And as teachers, get a better handle on how we can divide and conquer and support each other in areas where I might not be as strong, someone else can support me, but I can do something different for them and something that I'm a little bit stronger at. So here's our first reflection question. What are you currently working on in your PLC? And I'm guessing to some degree it's sticking into the literacy piece that we've talked about. Certainly it's around teacher clarity and developing quality success criteria. But how are you working together and how are you developing mastery around that? Take a moment, pause the recording, pause as long as you need. I'm only going to pause for a few seconds. Complete the reflection question, and then hopefully, or if you're in a small group, have some dialogue back and forth. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to pause the recording as long as needed. Again, I'm going to assume you did, so I can keep the webinar length as short as possible in terms of its full length, but please pause as long as you need to anytime. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we develop that positive interdependence. And I love this quote that was kind of a combination from King and Newman and Brick, who I'm going to talk about a little bit in their work, Brick and Schneider, with relational trust. But collective responsibility for the students, that we own it. We own when they do well, we own when they struggle, creates that proper peer pressure and the accountability. But most importantly, it eliminates the isolation. The more we're focused on some of the same things, we can own each other's successes and we can share in each other's challenges and trials. And there's the proper amount of peer pressure. In our profession, we are isolated on a consistent basis, and this helps break that down. This is some work from Joyce and Showers in the 80s, which they replicated again in the 90s and got almost the exact same results. What you see here is the percent of teachers that were implementing a new practice, like really working on text-dependent questions. After they learned it, they saw it demonstrated, had a chance to practice. Really, that's where we stopped after December 16th. And now, receiving corrective feedback, we're going to jump a little bit, but it's when it's that job-embedded coaching. And they defined, even back in the 80s, not necessarily having a instructional coach by definition that is constantly serving only in that role, but coaching within a PLC setting where we're all working with each other. We're coming to the meetings back and forth, sharing some of the same examples, results, getting feedback from our peers, and it's ongoing with what we do. Coming back to staff meetings and our early release times and focusing on some of the same essential topics. And what was really clear, we're so complimentary to the staff and Lataya's leadership, is there's a commitment to focus at David Reece, and that focus is for the adults. We have to allow our adult learners to get really good at things so they can then better implement and make the right kind of adaptations in the classroom. And so what I'm describing here is embedded in empirical research, but I think we would acknowledge it's embedded in everyday good old-fashioned common sense. But what also adds to that is relational trust. Joyce and Showers in their follow-up work in the 2000s. Teacher risk-taking growth occurs not from learning new theories, but from relationships that form on mutual trust. The more I trust you, the more I'm willing to take a risk. Brick and Schneider, in their work with the Chicago Public Schools, found that the only commonality in the early 2000s of the Chicago Public Schools that made huge turnarounds was attributes of relational trust within the PLC. And they defined relational trust around these four core elements: respect, competence, personal regard for others, and integrity. In a moment, I'm going to have us complete a short activity, but I put here the definition, which you also see in your handout, because I think our definition of respect might be a little bit different than theirs. Recognizing and showing appreciation for the role each person plays in a child's education. There's a couple aspects of this. One is that we acknowledge that the bus drivers and cafeteria staff and folks like that are at our clerical positions, they might play a critical role in students' lives, sometimes more than us. They might be that one adult that connects with the teacher. They also define respect as by not telling someone the truth about their performance is disrespectful. So if I come to a meeting and I've got some text dependent questions that I think align to the standard at the right level of complexity and they're really not, and somebody doesn't tell me the truth, they say, Dave, I think it looks good. That's actually disrespectful. Competence, that we acknowledge that, hey, here's an area I got to get better in, and I won't tell everybody that I can do it if I can't, but that's my area of growth. I'm going to do more than others would expect from me, and I'm going to have integrity. Meaning, if I'm going to commit to doing something in the classroom in the PLC setting, I'm going to do it. And so I'm going to ask you to pause the recording and individually take a moment, especially if you're in a group, and jot down what are some actions to increase relational trust in David Reece as a whole, but specifically your PLC, and then share those. And then I'm going to ask you to reflect after you do that on this final question. What's one thing that you can personally do to increase the relational trust of your staff members? So, kind of a combination activity. I'm going to just go a little bit faster here to wrap up this session. So, first, individually complete that activity with the 4 squares, and then have a discussion, but then have a final piece where you personally talk about what's the one thing you can do to increase relational trust. As always, thank you so much for your time and effort for everything you do for the students at David Reece. Karen and I are really excited to touch base with everybody soon. Again, we're going to follow up with several of these webinars, and please, during this process, do not hesitate to reach out to either one of us anytime. You see our emails there. There's our Twitter handles. And again, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk very soon.